Hello, my name is Ronald Gosses. I am living in Richmond, Kentucky, and we're in my home studio. And so I'd like to start by reading my artist statement. A true mystery of the world is visible, not the invisible. This line is by Oscar Wilde. It resonates strongly with me. Perhaps that is why I do not usually intellectualize my artwork. My artwork is driven by my emotions rather than my mind. Art allows me to express my visual responses in everyday stimuli. My paintings are basically three-dimensional abstracts, and I consider them to be a form of sculpture on canvas. They are not static, ever changing in different lighting and from different angles. They sometimes seem to elicit an almost involuntary urge to touch them. 3D seems to be today's catchword, applying to society's craving for ever greater experiences. Moviegoers stand in lines and pay extra for films presented in 3D. My newest collection of three-dimensional abstracts are not simply commercial responses to this phenomenon. They stand on their own as a natural progression of my abstract expressionist work. These paintings are done in oils, acrylics, fabrics, woods, metals, and vivid colors. They are three-dimensional abstracts, a form of sculpture on canvas. In this new collection, I've created art that speaks to all ages and all lifestyles. While each painting exhibits well as is, when seen through special 3D glasses and the layered dimensions are greatly enhanced. Viewers are excited and do not want to look away. They are drawn closer to the artwork as if they want to enter the canvas. The headlines today are frightening. Hate crimes, war atrocities, nuclear threats around the globe. Historically, artists use paintings, photographs, posters to show the strife of the world. I chose to honor my ancestors who stood up the worst of times. My new artwork beckons us towards what cannot be forgotten with the rise of fascism in Germany, Italy, and Spain in the late 1920s to the 1940s. I feel my family's past speaks through me in their fight for injustice. This is a small world. I found exactly how small it really is. In the 1970s, I was in retailing, and I was shopping for materials for our new store. I met a vendor, an older woman named Lilo Strauss. She immediately seized upon my name and asked where my family was from. I told her it was a city called Yilst in northern part of the Netherlands, in Friesland. She pulled up her sleeve to show me the concentration camp numbers on her arm. We were both teary-eyed when she explained how she escaped the camp and made it to the Netherlands. There she met my great-grandfather and great-uncle, both of whom were active in the Dutch underground. My great-uncle, we called him Umke, was a fisherman, and he literally put Lilo on his boat and covered her with live eels and rowed her out to sea. So that's basically why I'm doing this. I'm trying to create a look. What I do is I take old photographs of family members. I cut out the photographs and I put them on the canvas. I color the photograph, everything but their face and hands. I color their clothing, I color their hair. Then I create an abstract around it on what they are and what they did. So I can show you some of those if you'd like to. And the first one I'll show you it's called Brothers. During the Depression, my grandparents took my father and his brother back to the Netherlands because the Depression was not as bad in Europe as it was in America at that time, at least not in the Netherlands. They also had the family home that they could move to, and they escaped the American Depression is basically what they did. Yes, these are the two brothers, and you can see at the time they were from Chicago, and they traveled by train, and those little outfits that they're wearing, which was typical little sailor suits. My father remembered that when they got to New York and got off the train, something they never did before. They rode in a taxi to the train station, to the where the boat was, and they boarded the SS Rotterdam and went back to Europe. Now let me go get the next one. This is my great uncle. We called him Umke. He was a fisherman in the Netherlands. During World War II, he was part of the underground network, helping those whom the Nazis considered undesirable. He would place the refugees at the bottom of his boat, cover them with eels, and smuggle them out of the North Sea onto safety. In fact, being Dutch, they kept everything they had. That same boat that photographed him in is the same boat he took the undesirables out to sea in. Now I'll go get the next one. And this is called Not Your Secondhand Rose. This is my great-grandmother in her garden. Her name is Maud May Crandall. Surrounded by the roses she loved, she lived nearly to be 100 years old. Widowed while quite young, she ran the farm with the young toddlers and babes in arms. She was the first woman to drive a car in the county where she lived. She taught school and tutored privately into her 90s. She became a social worker and established the beach, one of the people who helped establish the beach house in Ohio. She was ahead of her times and would have gone into politics. She would have no trouble running this country. The beach house was a home for unwed mothers, is what they called them back then. She was also quite a person. She traveled the country and she worked for the Red Cross. And the Red Cross at that time, World War I, actually wanted to get into social work. And she traveled the country after the war, raising money for orphan children so they could go to college. And when she was raising the money, she insisted that went to anyone who lost a parent in the war or father. And those monies, she didn't care. She fought, well, let me back up here. She fought that it would be given to minorities as well, which was way ahead of its time because they were, especially in the South. So that's what she did. She was a most unusual person.
When did you start this series?
I started it all at roughly the same time. It was basically 2019 because what was happening, 2020 is when I really got into it, and 22. I have not done as much because I have been a full-time caretaker for my wife, and I can tell you about that later. So it was to the point where I was a full-time caretaker. She was in a wheelchair, so it was a rough time. Let me get the next one. This is the great secret of World War II. My father, Minnow, was stationed with the Medical Army Base on Tinian Island in the Pacific. The bomber, Enola Gay, flew out from the Tinian Island to bomb Hiroshima. My father and his medical team lined up to see the Enola Gay take off, although they were unaware of its mission or its destination. And in this painting, you will notice, you will see the Enola Gay flying away in the corner. And also you will see my father. He is the person with the blonde hair. And that's all of them lined up. So in that painting, I showed a bomb through the center. They were actually lining up for inspection when that photo was taken. Make sure I have the right one. This is my uncle reading the morning news. My uncle reading the morning newspaper in the Netherlands. He actually lived in their family home, which was over 400 years old, in the city of Eelst in Friesland. He was also the one who helped the undesirables escape out to the North Sea. This is him towards the end of his life. And this is gathering wood for the stove. That was my great uncle, Umke. He was using a wheelbarrow to gather wood. He was a fisherman. He was also very big in the Dutch underground, helping people escape. Again, it is using, actually, I found somebody threw out a little dollhouse, and when I was walking past, I picked up the little windows and stuck those in and created that look of him sitting at the table. Now, if you remember when I took that photograph that you see of him, part of that, there was no bottom. So I had to create like the legs, or I had to create feet, or so it's like I had to paint the other part in. And this one is called Tea, Coffee, or Cocoa. And again, you can see some of those dollhouse pieces that I picked up that were thrown out. This is of my grandmother, Dutch grandmother, who moved back to the Netherlands in the late 1950s after my grandfather passed away. She moved in with her brother, Umke, in their family home. Back then, even then, the Netherlands had free health care, something in America we do not. And this is called Dutch Brothers. It's of my father. They worried about, my family worried in 1936, worried about the Nazi invasion. And this is one of the last photographs of the two of them in the Netherlands. And so my grandparents, my father and uncle, all went back to America as they worried about the Nazi invasion after they invaded Poland on September 1st, 1939. The Netherlands fell on May 14th, 1940. Some of my family members in the Netherlands disappeared. Many lived through the war in the Dutch underground. And some of them even starved to death, as I said, or just disappeared. We found later, just within the last year, my brother's been doing genealogy. The entire family put together and shipped them back to America. We think we found out why they did that. We found out we have some Jewish heritage. So even though my brothers were these brothers, my father and uncle, were blonde, blue-eyed, but later it's people like me, I show up with black eyes. It's like, where'd they come from? Where everyone else. So way back somewhere, we found out we had two Jewish families, or they married Jews. So I think that's what they were worried about, which makes sense. By the way, my father, who became a medic, and my uncle, who was a little bit older, went into the Secret Service and was groomed as a German Nazi sergeant and dropped in German territory. And the reason for that is because they were raised in the Netherlands, and they had European habits, like Americans, the way we handle our forks when we eat. We would put the fork in our right hand, they would know right away. And so he had European habits. This one is the most recent one of the most recent ones. In fact, I don't even have hangers on it. This is called Life Saving. And it's a painting showing my father as a medic working in the Pacific Theater. And that was on the Tinian Islands. The U.S. Army, yes. That is my father in the center. He's in the center. And for example, this picture was taken like this. So everything down there I had to paint in. And this one, Shopkeepers, is a photograph of my Dutch grandmother and grandfather in the Netherlands as they were had a little shop as a grocery store, and so they sold groceries there. In fact, this one is really recent. And this one is of my mother, and she's sitting on the front porch of her house. And we lived in the Old West Inn during, it was like Old West Inn days where everyone would celebrate and they'd have house tours and things like that. And my mother also was, she was an art teacher and very involved with schools and enjoyed teaching. In fact, my mother was a teacher, school teacher. My grandmother was a school teacher, and my great-grandmother was a school teacher. So you had 3 generations. In fact, my niece, Anna Jo Gosses, is also teaches in school. She teaches special education. My mother, a little story, she at the time she always wanted to teach children who were poor. She didn't want to stay in a nice new school. She wanted to help, and that was why she started teaching. I'm going to sit this down. And the story about it is basically, it was near Christmas one year, and she came home. She's bawling and crying all the way. Well, my mother was the type of person who was very private about things like that. And we couldn't get over what was wrong with her. Well, why is she crying so? And she was crying because this child who had no money took a container, a paper container with Quaker oats, punched a hole in it and put some wallpaper around it, and gave it to her for like a yarn, to hold yarn, you could pull it out. And this is a child from a family who had nothing. After that, every year, my mother would make, she'd go out and buy, let's say, Christmas gifts for these families. And she would make me hide them up in the attic of the garage. And then towards Christmas, we wrapped them, and I'd have a Santa outfit. This is when I was in high school. We borrowed the Santa outfit, and she dropped me a block away and told me which number, which house, to ring the doorbell and to give them the packages. So she was very involved. In fact, when she retired, she was helped people with learning English. She would even go with these grown men when they went to apply for a job. She was trying to help them. So again, always helping people. So like I said, it must be in the DNA. I have a few other paintings. I don't know if you want me to show them. and I'll send you the photographs of this. This is Paradise, California burning. And again, as we're not paying attention, the environment is burning up. Climate change is a very serious problem no one really wants to talk about because fossil fuel is worth more money. And this one is just called The Earth is on Fire. And again, it's all, I did something different. I put them in ornate frames just to show you how silly we are, and went very contemporary, very abstract in the center. I have another one. It's sitting in the foyer. It's way too big to even bring in. And it's 5 feet tall by 4 feet wide. And it's called Honeybee. And it's basically, our bees are dying throughout the world because of chemicals we use in agriculture. It's Roundup, Monsanto. And these people get away with whatever they want to do. And it was interesting just recently in America, it was on TikTok of all places, and it was in the New York Times. And that is showing the contents of Heinz ketchup in Canada and Heinz ketchup in Europe, and what's in Heinz ketchup in America. In America, it had 9 or 12 items that you couldn't pronounce. High fructose corn syrup was the main sweetener. Where in Canada, it was just tomatoes, vinegar, and cane sugar. Just 3 ingredients. But with the others in America, it's all these chemicals. And it's also interesting when every time I traveled in Europe, I used to always lose weight, and I ate like a pig because their food is wonderful. And a lot of people say, well, you just were working hard or working long hours. And I says, no, that's not necessarily true. Now I know better because when we moved to Canada, my wife was a chronic asthmatic and usually very ill. All of a sudden started feeling better. And we really didn't know why. Well, we found out that a lot of their foods aren't fortified. We also found out that they use simpler ingredients. And when we moved to Maine, Yarmouth, Maine, again, she was feeling, I mean, she did go to the hospitals, but she was feeling a little better there as well. We found out because we started eating organic foods back then. And I think because of that, I think it helped her live longer. Even though she still suffered, it helped her live much longer than expected. I'm going through bankruptcy right now. My wife of 52 years, we lived together 52 years, had very serious health problems throughout her life. As doctors said that she would not live past 32. This is back when we were in our 20s. But she passed at 72 years old. I was her caregiver for over 5 years, where I was afraid to leave the house. I really did not do a lot of painting. I did a few of those that I did because and she was in a wheelchair. She had an open wound on her leg because of diabetes and everything else. She was a steroid dependent. I mean, you couldn't take her off of steroids because she'd go into apoplectic shock. She went Cyprus 5 times on me. And here's a woman she was a Metza, very smart woman. We probably got along so well because she always told me if I wrote anything down, she'd have to rewrite it. She says, don't you send anything unless I see it. And she always said she wasn't creative, but she was a very creative person. She could draw, but she didn't think she would draw something that she saw, and she didn't think that was creative. We were paying off all our health bills. The last 10 years was the most expensive. We had to refinance our home, and then we had to start using credit cards. So, as I said, I've hired a lawyer. America is one of the only industrial nations on earth that does not have free health care for all, which is sad. So we had insurance that we pay for through Social Security. And of course, since she's passed, I've lost her income, which was roughly $19,000 a year. So I was told by the lawyers that 70%, over 70% of all bankruptcy in America is the elderly because of healthcare. And if you are really truly sick, you have a serious heart problem, that's what happens. A lot of people think our healthcare is fine. They might have a heart attack, and they'll be in the hospital for so many days. After 2 weeks, you're out. They don't care who you are. And it's the same way with nursing homes. And of course, we know nursing homes are horrible places. But anyway, that's basically, I mean, she was in nursing homes a couple times for weeks on end. And the nursing home food was so bad that they said they basically feed them for roughly $2.50 a day. Well, you can imagine, she called it mystery meat every day when she got something to eat. So I would cook at home and bring her food. And of course, she was in Lexington, so I had to travel pretty far. I would have to travel an hour to get to her, and then an hour coming home. So it was a hard time. But some people said, well, they'll say, well, you know, you could have planned better, you could have done this. And I says, no, that was my wife, and that's what I did. So we had a lot of fun. We really enjoyed our life together. She was just a wonderful person. And like I said, she fought for different things. She fought even towards the end, she was still fighting for injustice, even the city where we are now. So she was very active. She'd get active in politics only because a certain person might be running. And she would be active in historic preservation throughout the country. In fact, she was the basic person who wrote preservation when we lived in Toledo. That same thing that she wrote was used in Colorado, New York State. It was used in Maine, or wherever, not just where we lived. People they would call her up and ask her about it. And so it was a very strong piece of ordinance to help save and preserve a lot of the historic structures, which they really don't want to do in a lot of places in America. So she became active in that as well. And active also, they were going to tear down an armory, which they did here in Richmond. And she was trying to save it because it would have made it was an inner city neighborhood. It was also not only inner city racially mixed, basically a black area, but it was also, she was thinking of homeless shelters, and there's no homeless shelter. So she thought it could be used as a homeless shelter, and there was a gymnasium in it. And so kids in the neighborhood, if they want to go to the YMCA, they have to pay $10 or $15 a day to go. Well, these kids, $10, $15 is like $15,000. They don't have it. So that way, a lot of kids in the city would have a gymnasium to play in, basketball or whatever they'd want. But the powers to be, of course, it's always developers. The developers here in this city said it would cost too much to seal it. Now, this was an armory. It was built to a very, very strong building. It was made out of concrete blocks with concrete floors. So at that time, the city said that it would cost, I think it was $1.2 million or $2 million, whatever it was, to seal it, and it wasn't worth it. So they wanted to tear it down. So she fought that, and she found a building that was power washed and sealed that was much more ornate, larger, that was owned by the county, and they did it for $250,000. not millions. So she was able to stop it for a while. But the last week she lived, the powers that be won, and they tore it down. But anyway, so but she did fight for it. So she was always a fighter.
How did your
Yeah.
neighborhood evolve over time?
Well, we've lived in so many different neighborhoods, so that's part of it. We originally were from Toledo. From Toledo, we moved to Denver, and she became active in politics and things there as well. From Denver, we moved to Cincinnati. From Cincinnati, we moved to Toronto, Canada, and we lived in Toronto, Canada for 2.5 years. Loved it, by the way. And the company we worked for went bankrupt. So even though I had a visa, I had to leave. So we decided to move to Maine. We always thought that would be a wonderful place to live. We also found out it was one of the few states that had, with insurance, you didn't, pre-existing healthcare, they didn't have it. So in other words, if you had a pre-existing condition, you could move there. And her being an asthmatic, that was a perfect place. It would be, at least her health coverage would be covered. Otherwise, it wouldn't be. So we moved there, and then we found out my parents were elderly, and so we decided to move back and help them. And so they lived in Maumee, Ohio. So we moved to Bowling Green, Ohio. And again, moved into a house and fixed it up and did the whole thing. And then from there, after my parents were in assisted living, and we decided to take a compass and find out someplace that's, let's say, 4.5 hours away. And we picked this city for some reason, probably at the time. So that's where I am now.
You take so much pride in your Dutch heritage. Do you speak the language?
No, I can do, no, I can. Well, my father could speak 2 languages, actually 3. He could speak German, he could speak Dutch and English, and he could also speak Fries. So Fries is the closest language to English, supposedly. And in Fries is boerenbredden and green cheese, bread and butter and green cheese. Boerenbredden and green cheese. It sounds, if not Nassizekant, if you cannot say this. Not abrupte Fries, you're not an upright Fries. So it has a lot of similarities. So it was fairly easy for them to then learn English. My grandfather, like a lot of Dutch people, was very bilingual. I was told he could speak 10 or 11 languages. Not only speak them, he could write them. So he was very bilingual. So I still have some cousins, actually living in the Netherlands. Whenever I went over to Europe, I would stop and see them. And they have passed, and their daughter still lives there, Niemendals. And they were involved as well in the underground. It seems like a lot of them were. So, and one thing I did not know, the Niemendals, they would take Jewish babies, bleach their hair, and make them into little Dutch children, hide them from the Nazis, which is something else I did not know. And she was involved with that. Her family was. And I think a lot of that, the reason I feel that way, and I'm proud of their heritage, I'm proud of my mother's side of the family as well. They all seem to try to do the best they could. They all try to stand up for injustice. And I think you'll find that, I don't care if it's being prejudiced against Black people, you can be prejudiced now against Asians, you can be prejudiced against the gay community. It's all silly. Why people are like that, I don't know. So a lot of people would say, well, just are we liberal? I guess you would say we are liberal. And I think a lot of that is when you're in the arts, and a lot of people who are really educated as well. And when I say the arts, it can be music, it can be poetry, it can be writing, it can be musicians, all kinds of things, including visual arts, seem to be the largest group of tolerant people I know of wherever I meet them. Oh, every now and then you'll get one that isn't, but the vast majority, I think you'll find, are very tolerant and very open-minded. So I think a good way to show the difference is to look at Broadway and then to look at Hollywood. Hollywood, you have to be beautiful. On Broadway, you can be heavy set. They don't care. If you can sing, you can sing. You can dance, you can dance. They don't care what you are. So there's the big difference between the two sides there. And I think watching the Tony Awards and watching the Emmys, you can see a big difference between the two.
Is there a Dutch artist, a Dutch painter who influenced you?
I've been influenced by everything. It's not just a Dutch painter. I mean, I'm influenced by different art from different groups of people. I mean, and what's coming out of African art right now is just wonderful, and what's coming out of Asian art, because it's just wonderful. So, no, I enjoy any type of art. I like to experiment. I don't paint the way you're supposed to. I was president of at one time, an artist club, and most of them were watercolors, and watercolors are wonderful. Yeah, that's nice. But they were you had to do it on a certain kind of paper, and not only on a certain kind of paper, you had to, it had to be so big, you had to frame it so this way or that way, and it's like, and so we had an art show, and I invited all the seniors in the city to enter it. And of course, when they would come with their artwork, a lot of the people from this art club, oh, this is horrible stuff. And I thought it was wonderful. I got all upset because one girl, she brought in something and she literally took a needle and thread and sewed part of her painting, which she did in oil, but she also used yarn. And I thought it was wonderful. So it's a lot of people, I think I call those people Sunday afternoon painters. And if you're a serious artist, you're always thinking of creating or doing something. Let's go back to my great-grandmother on my mother's side. That's the one with secondhand rose. When I was a little kid, like I said, she was a very strong woman. When I was a little kid, she said she'd give me piano lessons. So I'd go down to this teacher in the neighborhood, and I'd have these piano lessons. Well, after 5 piano lessons, the teacher says, I'm never going to learn to play. He dreams too much. He doesn't understand, he wants to do it his way. Yeah, he'll never play the piano. Well, that irritated my grandmother to no end. So she had a piano. This is back when organs were the big technology of the day. Today they aren't, but back then it was. So she decided to buy this little organ, which she did. She bought this little organ, and the organ, when she bought it, she said, I want 6 months of lessons for my great-grandson, and you give him lessons and you loan him this little organ. So they did it. Well, then all of a sudden I learned, I guess, fast on the organ. And so my parents, my father went out and bought an organ. And back then they were as expensive as, some of them were more expensive than a brand new Cadillac. So they were very expensive, and he bought one. And I learned, and at 16 years old, I started playing out at the Country Inn. And at the time, my great-grandmother, every weekend, it would have a picture of me sitting at the organ at the Country Inn. Rondie is what they said. And she'd cut that out, and she'd mail it to that piano teacher every weekend. So anyway, but that's just a silly story behind that. So no, I've met some wonderful people. My wife and I have, so we're just, and my wife was a big entertainer. I mean, we'd have hundreds of people over for parties or events, or it could be a political event. It could have been, I mean, she did everything. She really enjoyed doing that. She really knew how to put things together.
What are you working on right now?
Well, I'm working on a little bit of the art. I haven't played the piano since she passed. And when she first passed in February, that was a lot of, I had to go through so much because she was such a record keeper and a keeper of many things. So I had to go through a lot of that. And because she did all the finance, I had to go through all of that. And that's a learning curve as well. In fact, I'm still doing that. So I really don't know what the outcome. I'm not out of the hot water. Like I said, I have a bankrupt lawyer. I could lose everything and become a homeless person. I don't know. I just really don't know. So that's good. And even if all the bills were paid, it still would be hard for me to live because I have that less income. And my art is it's, I haven't shown it that much. And a lot of my art sold, if I'd sell art, it was usually sold in places like New York or you know, in galleries. I've shown in some galleries, but unless you're in somebody really top notch, you know, it's hard. It's hard. My niece, who was in Broadway, she was the same way. I mean, she just, they closed Broadway down. I mean, she was lucky enough to find a teaching job. So I mean, she had it rough as well. So it's so I mean, I don't know. And I have so much artwork. Being an artist, you produce a lot, and I've produced a lot just in the 13 years I've lived here. Even though I've sold some and I've, you know, given some to nonprofits, but I still just have a lot of art, and I don't know what I'm going to do with that either. You know, so it's at one time we wanted to create a foundation and help other artists, not just visual artists, anyone in arts, but that's passed too. So that's something. So I really don't know what's going to happen. I painted a little bit, not a lot. It's been very hard for me. We have an English setter. Even towards the end of Dinah's life, the last 2 weeks, I could not get that dog to go more than a house away. She'd pull me back, almost to the point where she pulled me down. So even though ever since then, I can get her maybe 2 houses, 3 houses away, and that's it. She will not. She has to come back. And so animals, I think, we don't understand them fully, but I think they have a form of grief as well. We just don't understand it. And I don't think they understand it, but that's, she knew something was wrong. So, and the worst part, like I said, the last 7 years, she suffered so. It was to the point, at least 7, 8 years ago, I started, when she still could go up and down the stairs, I would have to take breakfast to her or dinner upstairs many times. And it was getting hard for me to carry those things going up down the stairs. So, but I did. And then, you know, I would say the last 5 years were just horrific for her. She was in terrible, terrible pain. And with hospice, that's why I believe in euthanasia. We only have 3 places, Washington, D.C., Washington State, and Oregon are the only places that have euthanasia. I think Vermont is looking at it, as well as Massachusetts, because I think that's humane. Because I mean, and the worst thing about hospice, if they're in the hospital, they give it to them because morphine, and morphine is basically it numbs them, and what happens, they starve to death. That's what you're doing to a person. So it was where I had to give the morphine to her. Now the nurses would come. In fact, the last day she says, well, you have to give it to her every hour. And it was at night. And I remember waking up and I'd hear her moaning and I'd have to give it to her. And I just felt like I was the one who was killing her. So a lot of people think hospice is wonderful. Hospice is the best we have, unfortunately. At the time, it was very, for me, it was very hard. So.
How do you show your art?
Well, I'm trying to, the Clue Foundation in New York, I'm entering a contest there, and but it's a contest, and I'm going to be one of hundreds and hundreds of people. So I don't know if Clue's going to take me or not. And there's an emergency grant funding for healthcare for artists. I'm going to try to enter that too. But other than that, I just need somebody to help out, and I just don't have that right now. And because I was out of sight, out of mind for so long, that had a lot to do with it. And then the pandemic hit, that was bad. It's just one thing after another happened at the same time. So unfortunately, that's just the way the world happened. And also, when we moved here, we had, just tons of fun, friends. We got involved with everything you can think of. Well, the sad part is Eastern Kentucky University went through a program where they eliminated a lot of professors. At one time, all the people who worked there were on pensions. Well, they got rid of those people, paid off their pensions, and hired outside workers because it's cheaper. They don't have to have unions. And a lot of the teachers left as well. And a lot of those people were our friends. So a lot of them moved away. So all of a sudden, our friend base also got destroyed, basically. What income I do have from Social Security is I believe it's like $2,000 above poverty level, of course, so I wouldn't qualify for help with heating or help with anything like that. So in America, you have to really be down and out to apply for anything. So, that's just the way America is, unfortunately. A lot of people don't like to talk about it. They think, well, these people have to work. A lot of these people, in fact, Dinah used to volunteer to a lot of nonprofit groups here. And when she volunteered, like Salvation Army, they had, in the summer, they would go to the neighborhoods and we'd give out food, or peanut butter sandwiches. And even when she worked, they had like a little gift store there. She would work in it, and people would come in and they'd want food. And so like one man came in and he had no teeth. So Diana didn't care what people thought. She gave him all baby food in a jar because that was easier for him. So no, she had a heart of gold. So and I remember going with the Salvation Army in a little camper. It was like a little camper. We'd go to neighborhoods, give, food out. So, there's a lot of people that, are struggling, And yes, and the homeless population, I think, of course, that's a very serious problem in America. Of course, it is the world. And a lot of that is because a lot of nations is just getting too hot. A lot of dictatorships. People can't live in places like Iran. When temperatures get above 115 degrees or go up to 117, 119, people they're going to pass out. You can't live like that. So there's in fact, right now, they've had extreme storms in the South right now. Arkansas is going through a heat wave, Arizona. So, but no one wants to talk about it. It's just little on that. Well, we've had hurricanes before, not hurricanes like this, not where they're that destructive, one after another. So our weather patterns, and I believe I watch what's happening in Europe. It's happening in Europe as well. Is willing to talk about. Now they're saying that the glaciers are melting at a faster rate as well.
What would you like the viewers to take from this interview?
Well, I think you mentioned that. I think we should let the viewers know, one, that that climate change, and they need to know that that fascism is growing throughout the world. I think that's very, very important, and everyone really they don't want to talk about it, or they don't think, if it doesn't affect you. I think if you're one of the victims of one of these horrific hurricanes or tornadoes, you start to think differently, especially if you lose everything. So I think a lot of people aren't just young people There is a group, I guess, of progressives in America, which is wonderful. It's primarily young people. He says the young people and the elderly, it's in between, that are the more conservative and really don't see the form of fascism, So it's so I think if the big thing is to let people know that politically we need to look what's happening. And politically, it doesn't mean that you're in America a Democrat or Republican. It's a two-party system, unfortunately. But we have to change some of the parties, that's all. And I say both parties are corrupt because that's the way money works. One just happens to be more fascist than the other, that's all. A good example of that, delegates for Bernie Sanders. And when he was running, Diane and I that's when we got involved in politics because we really thought what he was doing was right. And it's interesting that when he was running against Hillary Clinton, this is how the political system works in America. The Democrat Party had super delegates. I call that the House of Lords. And the super delegates, like West Virginia, she did not get one vote. All the delegates were supposed to go to Bernie. But because she had super delegates, West Virginia gave the vast majority of the delegates to Hillary, not what the people wanted. So that just shows you, and also the delegates, when it came time to voting, were locked out in the hallways, so they couldn't vote, or they couldn't object. Those were the delegates, so that's how they changed it. Go on the internet and ask that question, what happened to, the voting at that time, and that's what you'll find. So, so we have to realize that, like I said, one's more fascist than the other, but we still have to realize that money talks. That's the same way with climate change, fossil fuels, nuclear energy. That's something I find you can't get rid of it. So what do you do with it? It never goes away. So we buried it in the earth. It's like it's going to burp up. Those are serious things. Yet we say, oh, that's better than fossil fuel. I don't know about that. So both of them are bad. I would be more afraid of nuclear energy than even fossil fuel. In fact, right now, you can look this up. State of Washington is having a serious problem where they buried all this nuclear waste. And now it's going to take billions and billions of dollars just to dig it up and try to move it someplace else because it's starting to leak. And if it leaks, it's going to go into the rivers, which go into our drinking water. And I'd like to also talk about redlining and what Diana and I did at that time. We have to remember when it was done and the era it was done in. A lot of people, we forget what people had to go through to get where they are today sometimes. The paintings that I'm doing, like I said, I try to create this abstract around it. But most of them, both on my mother's side, did a lot of things that were unusual. And the same as on my father's side. And for some reason, maybe it's in our DNA, I don't know. Between Diane and I, we did the same thing. A lot of people know what redlining is. In America, redlining is where they would draw a red line around something and say who can live where and who cannot live where. At the time, when the banks and insurance companies took a map of the city, they drew red lines around the areas they considered undesirable because of the color of the people who lived there. So these people, usually unable to get loans or insurance at all unless they paid excessive high interest rates. This was called redlining. 1979, when we lived in Toledo, my wife and I, in a racially mixed neighborhood, which we loved, we had purchased our home on land contract, but had difficulty when we tried to refinance it. Our banks explained in writing that we lived in an undesirable neighborhood. We would have been given the loan if we lived across the street. which was interesting. At that time, if you were Black, they didn't want you to live in a white neighborhood. And if you were white, they didn't want you to live in a Black neighborhood. You could buy in it, but they didn't want you to live in it. The banks figured that we were young and white and would not create a fuss. It was wrong. We had never heard of redlining before, and we could not believe that it was legal. We knew in our hearts that it was immoral. So we filed a class action lawsuit against the bank for discriminating practices. It was a long process, and we finally settled out of court. I mean, we were investigated by the FBI. We had dispositions. I mean, it was a long, drawn-out thing. But one of the results, since it was a class action, was that redlining would no longer be tolerated. Also, the federal government would be able to monitor all banks in the U.S. They insisted that every loan agreement included several pages from HUD, Housing and Urban Development. That is why today, when you buy a home anywhere in America, you have a stack of HUD papers to sign. That's because of us. And when we filed the lawsuit, we had no idea it would have such far-reaching effects. So it didn't stop. So today, if you have the money, you can live wherever you want. So there's still a lot of discrimination, but it was the beginning of something new.